Hello again. Welcome to my channel. This is Dr. Uche, your Dr. Booktuber, back to discuss another book with you. So before we even go ahead, remember to hit subscribe. That way you can stay up to date and follow the books that I post about, the reviews of books I'm reading to inspire you on your reading journey. I also love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment. Let me know what you're reading. Maybe that can inspire my next review. So we're going to dig into the discussion today. We're going to talk about, I'll be reviewing Stay With Me. Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. And I also will be talking about sickle cell disease because it's discussed very much in this book. And as your Dr. Booktuber, once in a while I have an opportunity to give a PSA of sorts. And so I will be talking about sickle cell disease. So listen till the very end and you'll be able to follow my discussions about that. Remember that everything I talk about is my opinion and mine alone and not affiliated to my employer. Also, my medical information when given is purely for entertainment and informational purposes. I am not trying to establish a doctor-patient relationship whatsoever. If you have a direct medical question, I do not give direct medical advice. I speak generally. And if you have a direct medical question, please do go to your doctor who knows your case well and can give you better advice, okay? Also, there is a full disclaimer on drucheoncology.com, drucheoncology.com. That's my website. So let's dig in. Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. Very, very interesting read that centers around a young woman, Yejide. Now, it kind of starts off in a situation where Yejide discovers that her husband has been pressured into marrying a new wife, a second woman. And why? This is in a Nigerian setting. And Yejide was not able to conceive after trying for so many years after she marries her college sweetheart. She meets her husband, Akin, in university, and they have a very much lovely love affair. They get married, but she's not able to conceive. And we get to learn along the way that Yejide grew up in a rather unfortunate situation where her mother died having her. So she grew up with her father and various stepmothers. Her father went ahead to marry a whole host of other women, and they didn't love her very much. So she had a very lonely upbringing where people didn't really care. She could do whatever she wanted. Nobody was invested in her success or her joy or in making sure she grew up in a good way, knowing the important life lessons. No one was really invested. But, you know, somehow she didn't do too badly. She ended up in college. That's where she met her husband, of course. So she is not able to conceive after marrying this man, and a second wife is married. Didn't have to live with her at home initially, but the whole idea was that the husband's mother, so the mother-in-law, was giving her a very hard time about not being able to conceive. And her thought was this young woman, the second wife, would have a child for her son, and they wouldn't have the problem of having no offspring anymore. And in a very nasty sort of way, there would be less pressure on Yejide because her husband would have a child and she could take her time and conceive or not. Never mind the bitterness of suddenly having a second wife dumped in your lap when your husband's left, right? Nobody cares what she thinks. So, you know, it might be an alien culture to some listening to this, but it is something that I think may even be going on now in some parts of the world. So that's how the book begins. So we learn later that along the way, Yejide has tried so hard to conceive. It did not work. And so she gets inflicted by this psychiatric condition, this mental illness situation called pseudocyesis, where a woman who's dealing with the stresses of infertility may actually feel like she's pregnant, may feel bloated, may have morning nausea, may have weight gain, may have the stomach growing, but she's not pregnant. it's actually a bit of a fake pregnancy related to a mental condition. And so month after month, you would expect the pregnancy to advance and a child to be born 9, 10 years, 10 months later, but it doesn't happen. So that's the difference with pseudocyesis, and repeated exams do not demonstrate a fetus. So she gets help for this condition. And it's surprising how the husband knew that this is not a real pregnancy. So we'll get to that a bit later. She gets help, she recovers, and somehow the husband's brother, Dotun, ends up in the home. He comes to visit. He has a situation with his own wife in another city. He loses his job, ends up in Yejide's home, staying with them. And he strikes up an affair with Yejide, or so she thought. We learn later that the husband had actually requested his brother, had this discussion with the brother, who knows that Yejide's husband has a sexuality problem, has impotence. And Yejide was so innocent and naive when they married that she did not know that was a problem. The husband convinced her that some men are like that. Some men cannot have an erection and some can. And she believed that. She didn't know better. So the husband and his brother, however, know this problem very well. Even before Yejide came in the picture, they knew about this problem as college students together. And the husband goes and convinces his brother to come and seduce his wife so that the wife would get pregnant, so that he could get his wife pregnant, because he was not able to do that. So Yejide, as far as she knows, has this brother-in-law who's flirting with her in the home, and she starts having an affair with him. That's how she saw it. But as you see, the story was a lot more complicated than that. And the arrangement was that the brother-in-law would step in at certain time points and help Yejide to conceive at certain time points, and they would have 4 children, and everything would be planned out. So every sexual interaction Yejide had with his brother-in-law would be pre-approved by the husband, pre-sanctioned by the husband at a certain time, and so on and so forth. He would be out of the way. He would come back when it's all done, like he didn't know, whatever. So it carries on, and Yejide has a first child who very sadly succumbs to SID, sudden infant death syndrome. Yejide is devastated. The husband is devastated. They try a second time, still having the affair, mind you. A second child is born. Child is diagnosed with sickle cell disease as a child. As a school-aged child, my understanding is he'd just gotten into school. He didn't live long. He dies in childhood. Yejide is devastated. So by the time she conceives a third time, again by the brother-in-law, mind you, she's married the whole way throughout this time. So yeah, like, how would she know? She probably wouldn't even know whose child she's having, right? Because she's having an affair. She's still married and obviously having a sexual relationship with her husband. They had misunderstandings, but I don't think she ever was clear in her mind who was the father of her children. So third child, by the time the third child is born, a girl, Yejide finds it hard to bond with this child. Didn't bond very well, especially when the child is diagnosed with sickle cell disease as well. You can imagine she sort of dissociates, because in her opinion, this child will likely not survive childhood. So why bother? Why bother reading to this child? Why bother bonding with this child? By then, the husband chances upon his brother and Yejide, his wife, in his home doing their thing. Now, this is not a prior sanctioned by him. This is now outside of the arrangement he'd had. Come in when I say you should come in, get my wife pregnant, get out of the way. Now they're having an affair, and now they don't have his permission at this point, right? So he catches his brother having sex with his wife at a time when it was not prearranged, and he is livid. it's already hard enough for him to deal with the fact that he's needing his brother's help for his wife to get pregnant. So he's battling that, not to talk about catching them in the act outside of the arrangement. So he and his brother have this terrible fight. The brother is thoroughly beaten up, ends up in hospital with injuries. He survives that, but their mother has an inkling that there was a big thing that went on, but nobody really owns up to her. They tell her this thing about some money misunderstanding, but she knows, you get the sense, the reader, that she knows there's more to this fight, but they don't tell her. Mind you, this mother is the one who made this man marry a second wife, so she was never quite understanding about this whole thing. So hey, are you surprised? I'm not surprised that the sons didn't tell her the honest truth. The brother who gets beaten up, he never lets up on his brother's secret, that the brother's impotent. He never gives it away to anybody, but he tells Yejide at the very end that this is why I was called, to help you get pregnant, and she is livid. So around the time this third child is born, Yejide and her husband are really not getting on very well. There's a lot of anger and resentment on each person's part. Yejide, in realizing that her husband has always had a problem, didn't tell her before they got married. The husband, angry that his brother had the audacity to carry on with an affair with his wife. And no doubt angry about the whole thing, that he needed to ask his brother for help about such an issue. So at some point, Yejide abandons her home. She goes off to another city, leaves her daughter with the husband. Mind you, she never could quite bond with this child because she assumed the child would likely not survive. But the child did. The husband was able to raise this child despite the challenges. And at the very end of the book, Yejide comes back in the picture when this child is now a teenager, or maybe older, in college, doing well despite the challenges. So again, speaks to sickle cell disease being livable for many people with the appropriate interventions early enough, and good medical care. So the end of the book is a bit of it's a happy reunion, perhaps cautiously happy. Yejide is pleased to note that her daughter embraces her as a mother and actually has some understanding of the situation that led to her abandoning the home. And I don't get the sense that daughter is very bitter. I get the sense that daughter has seen from other situations of children with sickle cell disease how much stress it can inflict on a marriage, on a family, how it could be possible for people to do certain things when they realize they have a child who's this ill. I don't get the sense she's very angry. I get the sense she's actually pleased to have her mother back in her life. Yejide is pleasantly surprised that her child survived. It looks like she went incommunicado for years, because I get the sense she and on one side and the husband, daughter on the other side didn't communicate for many years. And you get the sense there's a bit of a mend, or there's an attempt to mend the difference between Yejide and her husband. But this is it. This is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I loved the book. I loved how it shed light on many aspects of life. It may be alien to some people listening to this, but people in West Africa know very well about sickle cell disease. People in the US, quite frankly, in the African American community know it. It speaks to the ancestry of many African Americans. Their very distant African ancestry is mostly from West Africa, a little bit east. And we know that there's a lot of sickle cell in that area, that part of the world. Sickle cell trait has a survival benefit against some kinds of malaria. And now I'm I'm going into the hematology side of things. I said I'd talk about sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease happens when someone inherits a bad gene, a sickle cell gene, one from each parent. Now, this is a condition for this to manifest. You got to have two genes have a problem. If you have just one gene have a problem, you have the sickle cell trait. Sickle cell trait is very common in West Africa. I believe it's as many as 40% of the population have the trait. Now, among the African American population, I believe it's up to 10% who have the trait. So, if you have two people who each have the trait, or one person with sickle cell disease and the second person with a trait, then it becomes possible to have a child who gets one faulty gene from each parent. So mind you, a parent with a trait has just one faulty gene and one gene is okay. If they contribute the faulty gene and the other parent gives a sickle cell gene, you have a child with a sickle cell disease. If you have two people with the trait have children together, there is a 1 in 4 chance of having a child with a disease, 2 in 4 chance of having children with the trait, and 1 in 4 chance of having a child who's totally unaffected, no trait, no disease. What is it all about? Well, in the blood, we have red cells, we have white cells, and we have platelets. Platelets are cell fragments that float through the blood and help us to not bleed too much. If you have a little nick in the skin, the first cells that come there are platelets. They come there and they form a bit of a mesh and start to slow the bleed. If you do not have enough platelets, you're prone to bleeding from the surfaces. Now, there's a lot more complicated process. After that initial platelet plug has formed, a lot of proteins come in there and seal the area. So it's a lot more complex. But let's move to white cells. White cells help us fight infection. Red cells help us carry oxygen throughout the body. You take a deep breath, the oxygen in the air gets into the red blood cells. They carry it, transport it to the active tissues, the active muscles, the organs that use the oxygen. And then they carry the carbon dioxide and some of the products of metabolism back to the lungs. So when you take a deep breath out, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. So goes without saying, the red cells help you to have energy, stamina, help you to be functional, and do a lot of the activities where you have to exert. So sickle cell disease, the red blood cell has a problem because the only reason it's able to carry oxygen and all that is because it has a pigment called hemoglobin. In sickle cell disease, the hemoglobin has a problem. It is not normal. It does not form normally, which means that a red blood cell, which is supposed to be a very flexible, pliable cell, so much so that as it goes through the tiniest blood vessels called capillaries, it's able to sort of twist and turn and fold to get through very narrow channels. When you have sickle hemoglobin, when you have too much sickle hemoglobin, in tissues where there is not enough oxygen, that red blood cell crystallizes, or the hemoglobin crystallizes, and the red blood cell is not able to fold and deform to pass through. So the blood flow is kind of stuck and it doesn't get to the tissues properly, which means that people can have crisis. Crisis means you're not getting enough blood flow to the organs. You can have pains. You can have strokes, you can have blood clotting, you can have heart attack, anything that has to do with blood flow getting to where it should get. And in the long run, you can have damage to organs. You can have what we call pulmonary hypertension, where repeated blockage of the blood flow around the lungs sort of makes the blood vessels there not work very well, complicated mechanisms. You can have problems with the kidneys. These folks often do not make blood well because the hemoglobin has a problem, so the red cell does not survive as long, and so they tend to run low red blood cell numbers all the time. They always run a little low, so they always have anemia. And if you always have anemia, You may need blood to be given to you often. And if you get blood often enough, you get too much iron. You get too much of an iron load in your body. So the iron overload can cause damage to the liver and so on and so forth. So, that's sickle cell disease in a nutshell. People who have sickle cell trait usually do fine, but if they find themselves in situations with low oxygen, like a very high elevation, or they go through very rigorous military training, you can have people have sudden heart problems. So only in extreme situations do people with sickle cell trait struggle sometimes. Outside of that, they mostly do well. So sickle cell disease, I've already sort of talked about. I want to talk about prevention. The WHO defines prevention in 3 different ways. You can have primary prevention, where you prevent something from happening, period. Prevent that child from having sickle cell disease that you're going to have. Secondary prevention. Okay, the child has sickle cell disease at birth. How do I prevent complications? And tertiary prevention. Child has sickle cell, already is growing older, already has complications. How do I help them to live a better life, live a full life if possible, do not suffer too much from the complications? So the first step, how do you prevent your child from having sickle cell disease? It is important to know your sickle cell genotype. If you are from the correct part of the world, African American ancestry, West or East African ancestry, I think it is important to know, do you carry the trait? It goes without saying, if you don't have the disease, you have not had crises, and you've grown to adulthood, you don't have the disease, right? The question is, do you have the trait? If you have the disease, if you've lived with it, and you're going to have children with someone, do they have the trait? It's good to know. Do they have the trait? Or are they totally without the trait? No disease, no trait. So with that in mind, you can then know. If you have the trait and you have somebody who does not have the trait at all, no disease, no trait, you're not going to have a child with sickle cell disease with them, right? The worst case scenario is you have children with the trait. If you have the trait and you're having a child with someone who has the trait, then yes, there's a 1 in 4 chance of having children with the disease. 2 in 4 chance of having children with the trait. Only 1 in 4 chance of having children with neither trait nor disease. So that's how you can think about primary prevention. If it is that important to you, and it should be, if you know your situation, know the situation of somebody you may have children with, you are planning to have children with, that way you can be proactive, right? You can decide. There are some people who have the luxury of being able to do selection, right? Through in vitro processes, being able to select the child, the embryo with the genetics that is better preferred, without the sickle cell genetics, for example. Or some people may make a decision, it can be painful or hard, but can make a decision that they would rather not marry somebody with whom they are likely to have a child with sickle cell disease. So people can make that decision. Or people can make a decision to not have biological children with someone, right? There are many other ways of being a parent that is not only biologically. And then secondary prevention. So what if you have a child with sickle cell disease? Know it early, diagnose it early, get the child the help they need early, because there are medicines that can be given, like hydroxyurea or Hydrea, that can reduce in the body the level of that sickle hemoglobin. If you reduce the level of the sickle hemoglobin, it actually starts to approach the levels you find in someone with the trait. And as I said, people with the trait largely do well. So if you can reduce the sickle hemoglobin with a medication or with exchange transfusions, we call them, whereby you get connected to a machine that's usually in a more sophisticated setting. The machine removes your own red blood cells and gives you fresh red blood cells from a healthier person. So there are lots of things that can be done to reduce the amount of sickle hemoglobin that's circulating, causing problems. So in that manner, someone who already has a sickle cell disease can reduce their risk of the complications, the sickle crises, the kidney damage in the long run, the stroke, the heart attack. um, can also we can also take care of iron overload. Getting too much blood from other people can increase the risk of iron overload, but there are medicines that we can use to get rid of extra iron. So with good care from a hematologist, there are many ways that people can actually live a fairly healthy life with sickle cell disease, or if not perfect, which no situation is perfect, at least reduce the risk of complications. And tertiary prevention, so what if you have the disorder, you already have problems like iron overload? Ongoing treatment and care can reduce the chances of those complications deteriorating further. And many people can live close to normal lives, live well into adulthood, and be able to manage their condition. So that's sickle cell disease in a nutshell. I like how this book brought this very relevant condition to the forefront. I like how the book addressed things that are very important, how in Yejide's world, societal expectations, were detrimental, I feel like, to both her and her husband, really. So let's think of the husband. Society expects that a man is fully able to get a woman pregnant, has no sexuality problems, and his mother could not even wrap her head around the thought, didn't even entertain the thought that the problem could be with her husband, with her son, right? It had to be the woman's fault, right? It had to be pray for her, and he's got no problem. Society did not allow him to be honest, to say, hey, I have a problem, because of what society expected of him, to be perfectly able, right, to get a woman pregnant and to have no problems about that. Society then expects the woman to get married and have children and have no problems. And if there is a problem, it's her fault. So I feel like society got in their way of having an understanding marriage where everybody came in honest and it was clear, and they could put hands together and deal with a problem. And then he had to make some very nasty decisions, going behind his wife's back to arrange for her brother to step into a marriage. And the wife, he didn't even have the courage to tell the wife. I like to say I discuss books here and don't give my opinion, but like, you wonder, he at least owed his wife the truth. I talked to my brother about this. Yes or no? And the brother thought that he had told his wife. It was at the very end we realized the brother didn't know that, per their agreement, he didn't tell his wife that, hey, I spoke to my brother, I cannot get you pregnant, my brother will step in. I mean, the whole thing is nasty, but she was totally in the dark. He was making decisions, kept her in the dark. And again, societal expectations. He couldn't own up. He couldn't come out of him to say, I have a problem. I go see a doctor all the time, that's why. Till the very end, when she confronted him, when she had learned all about it. So that's it. That's my review of Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I hope you get to read this. If you do, I hope you leave a comment and let me know what you're thinking. Again, this is Dr. Uche, your Dr. Booktuber. Please do click subscribe and follow for my upcoming reviews. And you take care and stay well. Bye-bye.